Xtalks connects professionals in the life science, medical device, and food industries with useful content like webinars, job openings, articles, and virtual meetings to help you succeed in your career. This life science focused podcast brings together some of our editorial staff to share insights into the latest B2B industry news to keep you up to date.
Hello and welcome to the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. I'm Aisha Rashid, Senior Life Science Journalist at Xtalks.com, and this week I'm delighted to introduce a very special guest on the show. We have with us today Dr. Carlos Doti, who is the VP, U.S. Medical Affairs Oncology at AstraZeneca. Dr. Doti is a hematologist by training and is passionate about aiming to deliver treatments that have a real impact for people living with cancer across every aspect of their disease. He's been working in the industry for the last 14 years, 7 of which were at AstraZeneca in various roles. He started off in small markets like Argentina and then moved to larger global markets. And since 2022, Dr. Doti has been focusing on the U.S. market in areas including hematology as well as oncology, working in breast, lung, GI, and gynecological cancers, among others. This past November, AstraZeneca announced the FDA approval of a new combination therapy for the treatment of adult patients with hormone receptor positive, HER2 negative, locally advanced or metastatic breast cancer with one or more biomarker alterations, namely in PIK3CA, AKT1, or PTEN. The combination therapy is the company's AKT inhibitor TrueCap, which was the first in-class approval for AstraZeneca in combination with Faslodex. This milestone approval brought a much-needed treatment option for the nearly 50% of patients with advanced HR-positive breast cancer who have PIK3CA and AKT1 mutations or PTEN alterations and experience resistance to first-line treatments such as endocrine therapies and CDK4/6 inhibitors. To learn more about this very important recent approval and AstraZeneca's breast cancer portfolio, let's turn to Dr. Doti. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So I'd like to start off by asking, before we get into the approval of TrueCap, a very milestone, a big approval there, what have been some recent advancements overall in the treatment of breast cancer, and what are the unmet needs and gaps, particularly in advanced disease?
So I think breast cancer have seen many recent challenges. So a long time ago, there were only options for patients, even in first line or second line, were hormone therapy and then chemotherapy. With the advent of monoclonal antibodies, then a new era of treatment of breast cancer rose, and that gave the first directed therapy in breast cancer, which was HER2-directed antibodies. Since then, there was not a lot of new things coming until the CDK4, CDK6, first in second line and then in first line, which completely changed the environment for breast cancer. However, those treatments are very effective in first line if you're hormone receptor positive, in the case of the CDK4, CDK6. HER2 is very effective for first line if you have HER2 positive breast cancer, but there's a big unmet need after that. And unfortunately, most patients, specifically in the advanced setting, will develop resistance and will need additional therapy. Before capivacity, TrueCap, and other molecules, the main option was potentially very toxic or even chemotherapy. So the unmet need is still there. Again, we have made extraordinary advances in breast cancer, but because in the advanced setting, we're not there yet in terms of cure, we need better, more tolerable and more effective treatments for the second line and beyond.
And so in attempting to address the very significant unmet needs in advanced disease in breast cancer, could you tell us more about the recent FDA approval of TrueCap, which of course is the first in-class AKT inhibitor approved for HR-positive, HER2-negative advanced breast cancer?
So absolutely. In this specific setting, what you want to achieve with patients is continue with endocrine therapy as much as you can, because it's an effective treatment for diseases that have hormone receptor positive. That's where the endocrine drive comes from. because it's less toxic than other, there are options that you may have, such as chemotherapy, and because it can prolong survival. There is another molecule already approved in the PI3K setting, which is effective in that subset of population, but unfortunately is very, very toxic. And that is the limitation. So, and there's a trade-off, everything, how much efficacy do you need in order to tolerate the adverse events that the treatment will put you through? So the development of, instead of a PI3K inhibitor, an AKT pathway inhibitor, which challenges the whole pathway, including the top line PI3K, the AKT, and the PTEN mutations, is trying to circumvent that, to give a broader approach into this specific population with a better safety profile. And we achieve this by choosing a very specific regime, which is can be counterintuitive at first if you have patients in here, because you're not taking the pill every day, but you're actually taking the drug 4 days a week, and then you have 3 days off. And this was on purposely designed because you get a much more efficacy, because the level that you achieve in those 4 days is enough to control the tumor. But then those 3 days off is the ones that are actually giving you a better safety profile. So what you see is a better efficacy than the current options. It's also wider efficacy because it's not just one alteration, it's 3 of them, and a much more safer profile, which can then translate into better time on treatment, which can translate in better results at the end of the day.
Thank you for explaining the treatment regimen there for TrueCap. And so you mentioned this, and how TrueCap targets not 1, but 3, essentially 3 players in the PI3 kinase AKT pathway. And so there have been challenges in targeting this pathway. This is a very significant pathway, of course, in a lot of cancers, in terms of alterations in various molecular players in that pathway. So could you tell us about how new approaches like TrueCap are tackling challenges around resistance and potential activation of other pathways? So if you suppress the PI3 kinase AKT pathway, it's known that you can activate other growth pathways as well. So how does a drug like TrueCap address challenges around resistance?
So there's 2 things. So imagine that this is like a 3-step approach, right? So if you inhibit at a higher level, then lower levels can actually overcome that inhibition and become activated anyways. When you're actually inhibiting the whole pathway, not just one level, but 3 different, which is from the membrane to the nucleus and in between, then of course you're blocking a much more bigger pathway. And then the resistance, I'm not saying it's not going to happen, but it's less frequently because you are actually going deeper, not only to the membrane, but within the cell. So that is definitely an advantage. The other thing that there's no other AKT inhibitors today, but we do have several PI3Ks. And you mentioned before that I'm a hematologist by training, so I have some experience also in PI3Ks outside breast cancer in hematology. And the limiting thing on this, which is an extraordinary pathway if you can intervene it, is that it has a lot of adverse events. So much so that most molecules in hematology were actually discontinued because of the adverse events that they provoke. And that's why I mentioned before, which is we designed this specifically, not only to have a broader inhibition, but to have a dosing regime that actually can circumvent the adverse events, but still keeping the efficacy. That's the reason for the 4 days on, 3 days off. And what we see in the trial, and we've seen even from preclinical data and our early phase studies, is that that translates in better tolerability, which is the key to this game, because a patient and the metastatic advanced breast cancer, if you cannot stay on treatment, you cannot benefit from that constant inhibition. And this is a long-term therapy. So every day that you have to discontinue or you have to reduce the drug, you're probably not getting the full benefit of the treatment. And that's why we designed this on purpose with this regime.
All right. So could you tell us about AstraZeneca's breast cancer pipeline? Apart from TrueCap, what else is in the pipeline?
So before I go to the pipeline, if I may allow, because this is something that I'm very proud since I joined AstraZeneca. the history of AstraZeneca in breast cancer started almost 40 years ago. So this was the company that actually brought to the market tamoxifen, which was the first endocrine therapy for breast cancer, who has not only changed how we treat this disease for a very long time, but is actually today a very current treatment for most patients. So since then, we have been in hormonal therapies, both in breast cancer and prostate cancer, for several years. And since our new CEO joined the company a few years ago, there was a decision that we want to be strong players in oncology. And we have a big ambition to eradicate cancer as a cause of death. I know it's big. It maybe take decades to accomplish, but if you want to reach high, you have to aim high. And that's what we're thinking about. So once the new portfolio started to develop, breast cancer was an area that we wanted to invest heavily. Now, our first approach after tamoxifen endocrine therapy was Lynparza, which was approved in breast cancer for BRCA mutated patients. After that, with our partnership with Daiichi Sankyo, we brought to the market Enhertu, which completely changed the therapy of HER2 positive patients. So much so that the new readouts with DB04 and DB03 actually inaugurated like a new HER2 era, which is not only for the high expression of HER2 in breast cancer patients, but with low expression of HER2 patients. And that changed completely how we are treating today breast cancer, giving another non-chemotherapeutic option for patients in second line. And this molecule is advancing into other combinations and earlier lines. After that, you just saw about CAPI, that we're going now in second line, but there's some other efforts with TrueCap in triple negative breast cancer, and also moving this into earlier line, because we think that combination with CDK4, CDK6 can be a big opportunity to improve the combination with endocrine therapy in first line. We also have an ESR1 driven molecule coming to the market soon. And we also have a next generation of PARP inhibitors with more selectivity that are going our phase 2s and phase 3 trials. So all in all, our big ambition in AstraZeneca is eradicate cancer as a cause of death, as I mentioned before. But our ambition in breast cancer is to make sure that we offer one AstraZeneca containing regimen to all patients in breast cancer.
And of course, in oncology in general. And so I'm just wondering, for TrueCap, are there plans? Are you evaluating it in other cancers apart from breast cancer as well, or?
Yes, as I mentioned before, we're going to triple negative breast cancer and also earlier lines. But because this pathway is very active also in prostate cancer, we have already ongoing trials in prostate cancer, first and second line. And I think this is something that can also give another alternative for patients with this disease. There is some efforts in other areas early to know what are going to be the results of that, but definitely breast and prostate is in the very near term the focus for this molecule.
Perfect. And so in terms of, you did touch on this earlier, of course, in terms of the goals in breast cancer, what do you envision the future of breast cancer looking like? The field has made a lot of strides, a lot of innovative treatments, therapies, and a lot of game changers in the field, from tamoxifen now to TrueCap, hopefully. And so how do you see the landscape evolving? Is it still going to be a focus on targeted therapies, personalized medicine? These are themes that we've been seeing in recent years. And so do you think this is going to be where the field is continuing to head, or any other new approaches?
I definitely think that this is here to stay, not only because we now have the technology to get more targeted and to get to places that were not able before. A good example of this is one of the molecules that I forgot to mention in our portfolio is Xtalks, which is another ADC, right? So we started our antibody drug conjugate strategy with Enhertu, but there are other ways of targeting novel targets, which is like with using ADCs instead of just directed monoclonal antibodies. So that is definitely here to stay. combinations, it's the other way to go. So if you see our portfolio, we're very proud about all the different mechanism of actions that we have here. But if you actually put all the mechanism of action in these charts to cross them about potential synergies between them, we can offer a lot more of opportunities for patients. Now, the unmet need that is not related just on the treatment, that we need to work together, and this is not just an industry thing, it's the whole society thing, still relates to diagnosis. So the reality of early diagnosis in the US is completely different than outside of the US, and that is a commitment that we need to do together. And for example, in the specific case of TrueCap, right, it is linked to a specific test, as you just mentioned, which is readily available. For example, in the US, you can actually order, and it's part of the panel for NGS in the metastatic setting in the second line, and it's already there. However, only about 60% of patients with breast cancer get that NGS panel before the treatment decision is doing. So there's a lot of education that involves the physicians, the health system, the patients, the caregivers, on how to drive that diagnosis. Because if we produce the best treatment possible, but we don't diagnose earlier, we're still only going to improve the outcomes, but not reach where we want to be, which is eradicate cancer as a cause of death, or even better, cure at early stages. And we know that early stage is the key, at least today, for cure.
No, that's a very important point and really great to hear from, a drug maker as big as AstraZeneca, really focusing not only on treatment, but also the diagnosis aspect. And it has to really be a holistic, all-encompassing approach. So I really like that. And I appreciate that perspective. And so in terms of the short and long-term goals, for yourself in directing the oncology pipeline in the US, what can we expect in the coming months and the coming years?
Oh,
a lot. I know.
yeah. This is one of the most exciting times in AstraZeneca. And let me put this in context. We are treating with devastating diseases. So it's not exciting because of what's coming. It's because we think that we have one of the best opportunities to bring new opportunities to patients, no longer for longer survival, but better quality of life and eventually more cure. So to give you just a couple of numbers, in 2023, we have 10 readouts, well, actually 11 readouts. 10 of them were positive readouts. That means that in the near future, those readouts will transform into approvals. We're expecting in 2024 more than that. So we are growing, and as a company now we have a big responsibility, which is how to partner more with all stakeholders, physicians, patients, caregivers, payers, and make sure that we achieve our goal, which is, I'm a very simple person. So when my kids ask me, well, how would you describe what you do? It says, well, I have a responsibility, which is make our compounds available to more patients faster. If I accomplish that, then I'm happy. Yeah. So it's not just getting the compounds out, it's reaching more patients as fast as we can. So those readouts will transform into new options, but the additional component is the education, the diagnosis, and the access that we need to secure so that patients can benefit from these new therapies.
Well put. And I think that's a great way to end off definitely the discussion. Dr. Doti, thank you so much for your time. I actually am thinking about another question, but sure. I'm not sure if it might be. I know that AstraZeneca presented new data at the San Antonio Breast Cancer Symposium. Is that something that you can maybe touch on? I know there were a couple of products and molecules there that were relevant to breast cancer as well. So is that, well, obviously at the Breast Cancer Symposium, but is that something that you'd like to touch on, or?
So definitely, since we came back into this new area of breast cancer, we have invested heavily, and San Antonio has become one of the most important congresses for us, not only to present our data, but also to interact with stakeholders in the area, understand more of what the impact of our molecules and new molecules will coming in. And we presented data not only on CAPI or on TrueCap, but also on Enhertu, on Data-DXd, our TROP2 directed therapy, and PARP1 Select, and other things coming. So again, I think it's very important that we continue to follow on this trend, which is develop new molecules, identify new targets, and most importantly, combinations, right? We know that the key to the game in some of these diseases, and breast cancer is not different from others, is how can we combine these molecules as early as possible to achieve a cure. So if you think you've seen a lot in San Antonio, wait until you see ASCO this year and San Antonio.
Right.
We're going to bring a lot more news, and hopefully we'll bring more opportunities to patients too.
Yep. Amazing. Thank you very much, Dr. Doti, for being on the show today. Again, I really appreciate your time and for your insights and for all of the amazing perspectives and the work that you've shared that is going on at AstraZeneca and that very important work that you're leading. So thank you so much for all that you do and for being with us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
That's the end of this episode of the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. If you liked today's show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Thank you, everyone, and see you all next week. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. If you enjoyed our discussions today, please share the episode with your friends and colleagues, and be sure to subscribe in order to be notified when a new episode is released. To join in on the discussion, you can find Xtalks on social media, email podcast@xtalks.com, or comment on the articles directly. Links are in the show description. Take a moment to join our community at xtalks.com to get access to everything we have to offer, including webinars, job listings, virtual meetings, articles, and more. The views and opinions expressed in the podcast are those of the speakers sharing them. They should not be taken as professional advice and do not necessarily reflect the policy or position Honeycomb Worldwide. For further information, email us at podcast@xtalks.com. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.